Bluetooth mode.
The idea of existence as a system demanding repayment of time, labor, or compliance introduces a conceptual framing that extends beyond the structural reality of involuntary birth. Within this philosophy, existence is not a transactional system in which participation must be justified through external compensation. Instead, it is a condition into which consciousness is placed and within which it operates for a finite duration, without inherent obligation to the system itself, beyond the consequences of interaction with other conscious entities. Early life suffering introduces a particularly significant dimension to this framework. Because consciousness is not initiated with pre-established interpretive capacity, early experiences can disproportionately shape foundational cognitive and emotional structures. The absence of choice at the point of entry into existence means that initial conditions are externally determined, and those conditions can carry lasting influence on the development of perception and interpretation. This gives early suffering a structural weight, not because it carries inherent metaphysical significance, but because it occurs at a stage where interpretive frameworks are not yet stabilized. Despite this, the inability to retroactively choose non-existence once existence has begun reinforces a final asymmetry. Even if existence is understood as involuntary, there is no mechanism within consciousness that allows for reversal of that condition. The conceptual possibility of non-existence remains accessible only as abstraction, not as an experiential option. Within lived reality, existence continues regardless of its evaluation, meaning, or perceived justification. As a result, existence remains structurally indifferent to fairness. Fairness presupposes a framework in which distribution, consent, or moral balancing can be evaluated against an agreed system of value. In involuntary existence, no such system is present at the point of entry. Therefore, fairness does not function as a foundational property of existence itself, but as an interpretive layer applied after consciousness has already begun. Whether existence is fair, unfair, or irrelevant to fairness becomes a secondary classification imposed upon a condition that precedes evaluative frameworks entirely. Thus, birth remains what it structurally is, an involuntary transition into conscious experience within a system that does not require consent to initiate participation and does not provide external justification for the conditions under which that participation begins. Everything that follows exists within that framework, not outside of it. Vinen extended Turner, involuntary existence also reframes the relationship between agency and origin. Agency is often treated as though it is foundational to the self, yet in this structure it appears only after existence has already begun. The capacity to choose, reject, evaluate, or direct action emerges within a system that was itself initiated without choice. This creates a layered hierarchy in which agency is not the origin point of consciousness, but a later development within it. Consciousness, therefore, does not begin as an agent, it becomes one over time. This distinction has significant implications for how autonomy is understood. Autonomy is frequently assumed to be an inherent property of being alive, yet within the structure of involuntary existence, it becomes a conditional development rather than a starting condition. The early state of consciousness is not characterized by autonomy, but by dependence. Dependence on environmental input, biological development, and external structuring forces that shape the emergence of cognition. Autonomy is therefore not granted at birth, but constructed gradually through interaction with conditions that were themselves not chosen. Within this model, the concept of self-determination must also be reinterpreted. If the initial conditions of existence are externally imposed, then all subsequent self-determination operates within constraints established prior to the formation of the self. The range of possible outcomes is therefore not infinite in a practical sense, but bounded by the structure into which consciousness is placed. This does not eliminate agency, but it situates agency within a pre-existing framework that defines its limits. As a result, existence becomes a layered system in which initial conditions, developmental processes, and emergent agency are all temporally ordered but not equally foundational. The origin point remains non-volitional, the developmental phase remains externally influenced, and only later does internalized decision-making emerge as a functional capacity. This progression does not negate agency, but it reframes it as an emergent property rather than a defining essence. When considered in aggregate, this structure produces a condition in which consciousness is simultaneously autonomous and non-originating. It can act, decide, and reflect, yet it cannot trace its own origin to any act of will. This creates a persistent asymmetry between control and emergence. Control develops within a system that was never under control at its inception. This asymmetry extends into how value systems are formed. If initial conditions are not chosen, then the frameworks through which value is interpreted are also initially unchosen. Early cognitive structures are shaped by environment, exposure, reinforcement, and constraint rather than by deliberate selection. Even later reinterpretations of value operate upon foundations that were already established prior to reflective awareness. This does not invalidate those values, but it situates them within a history of formation that is itself involuntary. From this perspective, the idea of life as a given condition becomes more precise. It is not merely that existence is received without consent at the moment of birth, but that the entire structure of subsequent development is built upon that initial lack of consent. Every layer of identity, interpretation, and belief is constructed upon a foundation that was not authored by the consciousness that now inhabits it. This does not diminish the reality of those layers, but it defines their origin as structurally external. Even the experience of resistance to existence must be understood within this framework. The capacity to question, reject, or struggle against existence arises within existence itself. There is no external vantage point from which existence can be evaluated prior to entry into it. Therefore, all forms of existential evaluation are internally generated responses to conditions already in motion. The awareness that existence was not chosen is itself a product of existence continuing long enough to reflect upon its own emergence. This produces a recursive structure in which consciousness reflects upon its own involuntary origin while remaining unable to access any state outside of that origin. Reflection does not create distance from the condition being analyzed. It operates entirely within it. Thus, even the critique of involuntary existence is itself an expression of that same involuntary existence continuing to process itself. Within this recursion, the idea of escape from existence becomes conceptually distinct from experiential reality. While abstraction allows for the formulation of non-existence as a concept, there is no internal mechanism within consciousness that permits its actualization through will alone. Existence persists regardless of evaluation, and awareness remains bound to its own continuity until cessation occurs through conditions external to subjective control. Therefore, involuntary existence is not merely an initial condition, but a continuous structural reality. It defines not only the origin of consciousness, but the entire domain within which consciousness operates. Every thought, interpretation, and valuation occurs inside a system that began without consent and continues without requiring ongoing consent to persist. In this sense, existence is not something that is entered once and then independently navigated, but a continuous condition that remains active for as long as consciousness persists. Birth is not only the beginning of experience, it is the establishment of a framework that never ceases to define the boundaries of that experience. Childhood and formation. Childhood, within the structure of involuntary existence, functions not as a passive phase of life, but as the primary formation layer through which consciousness is shaped into a stable interpretive system. It is during this period that the raw capacity for awareness begins to organize itself into identity, behavior, and perceptual frameworks that later define the adult experience. In this sense, childhood is not a preparatory stage for personhood. It is the stage in which personhood is actively constructed. The relationship between genetics and experience within this formation process is not strictly hierarchical, but interdependent. Genetic structure provides the foundational constraints and capacities within which consciousness emerges, influencing cognitive potential, emotional sensitivity, and behavioral tendencies. However, experience operates as the dynamic force that activates, modifies, and stabilizes these underlying structures into functional identity. Rather than existing in opposition, genetics and experience operate as codeterminants of form, where one defines possibility and the other defines realization. Within this framework, a child is not a partial person awaiting completion, but already a person in an active state of formation. Consciousness does not wait to become real, it is immediately real upon emergence. What differs is not the existence of personhood, but its level of structural development. Early consciousness is less stabilized, less differentiated, and more reactive to immediate conditions, but it is still a complete instance of subjective existence. The question of whether childhood experiences can be overwritten later in life introduces a distinction between alteration and erasure. Certain experiences may be cognitively suppressed, emotionally recontextualized, or consciously reframed to the point of reduced influence on behavior. However, suppression is not deletion. Even when memories appear inaccessible or irrelevant, they remain embedded within the structural architecture of cognition, influencing response patterns, emotional thresholds, and interpretive bias in ways that may not be consciously recognized. Thus, while identity can be modified over time, it is never fully separable from its formative inputs. Identity formation itself operates through a dual mechanism of environmental input and internal response. External conditions provide the raw material of experience, while internal processes determine how that material is organized into patterns of belief, behavior, and self-concept. Neither operates independently. Environment alone does not determine identity, nor does internal choice exist in isolation from environmental constraints. Instead, identity emerges from continuous interaction between the two, with varying degrees of influence depending on developmental stage and psychological stability. Within early development, the degree of conscious control over identity formation is minimal. Conscious agency exists in embryonic form, but is not yet fully capable of self-directed structuring. As a result, early identity formation is largely governed by exposure, repetition, reinforcement, and emotional intensity rather than deliberate selection. This does not eliminate agency entirely, but it situates agency as a gradually emerging capacity rather than an initial condition of childhood consciousness. Emotional experience during this formative period carries disproportionate structural weight compared to later intellectual learning. This is not because emotional experience is inherently more valuable, but because early consciousness lacks the interpretive complexity required to fully separate emotional intensity from identity formation. Emotional events encountered during early development are more likely to become embedded as foundational reference points, shaping subsequent interpretation of self, others, and reality. Intellectual learning, while significant, typically operates upon an already formed emotional framework rather than replacing it. Within this structure, the notion of a stable self becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Stability, when examined across time, appears not as an inherent property of identity, but as a temporary equilibrium maintained within continuous change. Identity does not remain fixed. It continuously adapts, reorganizes, and reinterprets itself in response to new conditions. What is perceived as stability is therefore a pattern of relative consistency within an otherwise dynamic system, rather than evidence of a permanent internal core. Trauma within this system functions not as a singular definitional force, but as a high-intensity restructuring event. In moments of extreme psychological or physical stress, the underlying adaptive systems of consciousness are exposed in their most immediate form. Responses in such states often reflect deeply embedded survival mechanisms that operate beneath conscious deliberation. These responses can become integrated into identity, distort pre-existing interpretive frameworks, or reveal underlying behavioral tendencies that were previously unrecognized. Trauma, therefore, does not singularly define identity, but it can significantly reorganize its structure depending on intensity, context, and subsequent integration. The persistence of identity through time raises the question of whether a person can ever fully separate from their formative conditions. While partial separation is possible through reinterpretation, cognitive restructuring, and experiential divergence, complete separation is structurally limited. Identity is cumulative rather than replaceable. Each stage of development layers itself upon previous configurations, creating a composite structure that retains traces of earlier states even when later states appear dominant. From this perspective, childhood does not merely influence adulthood. It constitutes the foundational architecture upon which adulthood is constructed. However, this does not imply determinism in an absolute sense. While formative conditions establish constraints and tendencies, they do not fully dictate outcomes. Variation remains possible within the bounds of those constraints, allowing for divergence, adaptation, and transformation over time. Finally, the question of moral responsibility within this structure introduces a distinction between causation and justification. If behavior is shaped by formative conditions, then understanding those conditions becomes essential for interpreting behavior accurately. However, explanation does not equate to excuse. The recognition that individuals are shaped by their experiences does not negate their capacity for intelligence, reflection, or change. Instead, it situates responsibility within a framework that acknowledges both structural influence and emergent agency. In this sense, moral evaluation becomes more precise rather than eliminated. Behavior can be understood as the product of layered influences without abandoning the recognition that individuals operate within present capacities that allow for awareness and adjustment. Responsibility, therefore, exists not as an absolute moral weight detached from causality, but as a functional recognition of agency within constrained developmental history. Thus, childhood and formation represent not a temporary stage of life, but the primary structural process through which consciousness becomes organized into a persistent, yet continuously evolving identity. It is the point at which existence begins to take shape, not through choice, but through the accumulation of conditions that precede and outlast awareness of their influence. Suffering and adaptation. Suffering, when examined within the structure of lived existence, emerges not as an abstract philosophical necessity, but as a direct condition of experience that varies significantly based on external circumstance, internal resilience, and structural environment. Within this framework, suffering is not inherently embedded as a required component of life, but is instead unevenly distributed across individuals and systems, often correlating strongly with material conditions, access to resources, and the stability of the environment into which consciousness is placed. From this perspective, suffering is not universal in its intensity or inevitability. While it may appear across all forms of life, its severity, frequency, and duration are not consistent across individuals. Instead, it is often deeply influenced by external structures, particularly those related to economic stability and resource availability. Wealth, in this context, functions not as a moral determinant, but as a structural buffer that reduces exposure to certain forms of avoidable suffering. Conversely, lack of resources increases vulnerability to conditions that generate persistent stress, instability, and harm. In this sense, suffering is not distributed evenly, but rather shaped by systemic and environmental conditions that exist prior to individual agency. Within this interpretation, suffering does not serve an inherent positive function. It is not considered a necessary mechanism for growth, enlightenment, or moral development. Instead, it is viewed primarily as a negative condition, one that imposes strain upon consciousness and disrupts stability. While some philosophical or cultural systems attempt to assign constructive value to suffering, such interpretations are not treated here as intrinsic truths, but as post hoc justifications developed by individuals attempting to rationalize endured conditions. In some cases, these rationalizations extend into belief systems that normalize or even glorify suffering, often as a psychological response to repeated exposure rather than as an objective assessment of its role in existence. Despite this, it is observed that adaptation occurs in response to suffering. However, adaptation does not necessarily equate to improvement. Instead, adaptation frequently manifests as desensitization, where repeated exposure to adverse conditions reduces emotional responsiveness rather than resolving the underlying source of distress. This form of adaptation can create the appearance of resilience while simultaneously masking internal deterioration or normalization of conditions that would otherwise be recognized as harmful. In this way, adaptation is not inherently a marker of strength, but a survival mechanism that adjusts perception and response to sustained pressure. There are limits, however, to the informative value of suffering. While in certain cases suffering may lead to insight, awareness, or behavioral adjustment, such outcomes are not guaranteed nor consistent. Much suffering exists without producing meaningful informational gain, instead accumulating as persistent strain without resolution or transformation. In such cases, suffering becomes repetitive rather than instructive, functioning more as an ongoing burden than as a source of understanding. Within human populations, awareness of one's own suffering varies significantly. Some individuals possess the capacity to accurately identify, interpret, and contextualize their suffering within broader life conditions. Others, however, remain partially or entirely unaware of the structural causes or implications of their distress. In such cases, suffering may be misattributed, rationalized, or externalized in ways that obscure its actual origins. This is particularly evident in conditions where coping mechanisms alter perception, such as substance dependence or chronic avoidance behaviors, where the recognition of suffering becomes distorted or suppressed rather than directly engaged. Adaptation to suffering can therefore be understood as operating across multiple levels, as survival response, as psychological adjustment, and in some cases as structural damage control. It enables continuation within adverse conditions, but does not necessarily resolve or eliminate those conditions. As a result, adaptation may preserve functionality while leaving underlying sources of suffering intact. Within this structure, the distribution of suffering appears fundamentally arbitrary. Here is no consistent system by which suffering is allocated in proportion to merit, awareness, or moral positioning. Instead, it arises through a combination of environmental exposure, systemic conditions, chance, and structural inequality. This arbitrariness reinforces the absence of inherent moral organization within suffering itself. It occurs without regard to fairness, intent, or justification embedded within reality. The effects of suffering on identity are not uniform. In some cases, suffering alters behavior, perception, and emotional response without fundamentally changing the underlying structure of identity. In other cases, particularly when sustained or intense, suffering may contribute to deeper alterations in how identity is formed, expressed, or understood by the individual. However, even in such cases, suffering does not define identity in isolation. It interacts with existing structures shaped by prior development, environment, and cognitive framework. When considered at a systemic level, suffering does not appear to be an inevitable requirement of existence itself, but rather a condition that can be significantly reduced through structural, environmental, and social intervention. The existence of suffering is not treated here as a necessary metaphysical constant, but as a variable condition influenced by the organization of human systems. As such, it is conceptually possible for suffering to be minimized substantially, even if not entirely eliminated in all conceivable forms. Within this interpretation, the appropriate orientation towards suffering is not acceptance as a necessary good, but active minimization wherever possible. The presence of suffering does not justify itself through necessity, nor does it gain philosophical legitimacy through endurance alone. Instead, its existence is treated as a condition to be understood, reduced, and managed rather than embraced as structurally required. Even so, the complete elimination of suffering does not appear guaranteed or universally achievable under all conditions of existence. However, its reduction remains a coherent and meaningful objective within the constraints of human systems and behavior. The absence of inevitability does not diminish its impact, but it does clarify that its presence is not a fundamental requirement of existence, but a contingent feature of how life is currently structured and experienced. Thus, suffering remains a deeply uneven, structurally influenced, and often non-informative condition of conscious existence. Its role in shaping identity is secondary to its role in shaping survival responses, and its philosophical significance lies not in justification, but in recognition of its variability, its arbitrariness, and its potential reducibility within lived reality. When extended further, the relationship between suffering and adaptation reveals an additional structural paradox. Systems of consciousness do not distinguish in real time between adaptation that preserves well-being and adaptation that preserves mere functionality. The continuation of operation within a system is often interpreted externally as stability or success, yet internally it may represent nothing more than the minimum threshold required to maintain coherence under pressure. In this sense, adaptation can create a divergence between outward continuity and inward condition, where a system continues functioning while simultaneously deteriorating in qualitative experience. This distinction becomes particularly significant when considering long-duration exposure to adverse conditions. Over time, repeated stressors do not simply accumulate as discrete events, but begin to reorganize baseline perception. What was once interpreted as abnormal becomes normalized, and what was once recognized as suffering becomes integrated into the expected structure of experience. This shift does not eliminate suffering, it reclassifies it within perception. As a result, the threshold for identifying suffering becomes progressively distorted, not because suffering itself changes, but because the interpretive system recalibrates itself to maintain functional continuity. Within this framework, adaptation must be understood as fundamentally non-evaluative. It does not inherently distinguish between beneficial transformation and harmful stabilization. Instead, it responds to environmental pressure by adjusting internal parameters to maintain continuity of operation. This makes adaptation structurally neutral with respect to outcomes, even if its consequences are subjectively interpreted as positive or negative. The same mechanism that allows survival under adverse conditions also allows prolonged exposure to conditions that would otherwise be recognized as unsustainable. This leads to a further implication. The persistence of a system is not evidence of its optimal condition. Continuation does not imply adequacy, it merely implies sufficiency. A system may persist under conditions far below ideal thresholds without failing, and in doing so may give the appearance of stability while operating under continuous strain. Thus, survival and well-being are not equivalent metrics, and adaptation does not guarantee alignment between the two. In examining suffering as a distributed phenomenon, it becomes increasingly apparent that structural and environmental conditions play a decisive role in determining exposure levels. However, once suffering is present within a system, its propagation is not solely dependent on external factors. Internal reinforcement loops can emerge in which initial conditions of distress influence perception, behavior, and subsequent exposure, creating recursive patterns that sustain or amplify the original condition. These loops do not require external reinforcement once established. They can persist internally through cognition, habit, and expectation. At the same time, not all suffering operates through recursion. Some forms of suffering remain situational, transient, and context-bound, resolving once external conditions change. The distinction between transient and structural suffering becomes important as it reveals that suffering is not a singular category, but a spectrum of persistence, intensity, and integration within consciousness. Some suffering dissipates without long-term impact, while other forms embed themselves into the structure of identity and perception. Within this spectrum, the role of interpretation remains significant but not decisive. Interpretation can modify the experience of suffering, alter its perceived meaning, or influence behavioral response, but it does not necessarily eliminate the underlying condition producing it. This creates a separation between experiential modulation and structural resolution. Consciousness may reinterpret suffering in ways that make it more tolerable, but reinterpretation does not inherently remove the source of strain. Over extended periods, this dynamic produces a condition in which consciousness becomes partially shaped by what it has endured, not because suffering is inherently formative in a positive sense, but because repeated exposure alters the parameters through which all subsequent experience is processed. This does not imply that suffering creates identity, but that it contributes to the ongoing configuration of interpretive systems that define how identity perceives itself and its environment. Despite these effects, suffering does not attain any intrinsic necessity within the structure of existence. Its presence does not indicate requirement, purpose, or philosophical inevitability. Instead, it remains a contingent outcome of how systems are arranged, how environments are structured, and how interactions occur within those environments. The fact that suffering can be explained does not transform it into something required by the system that produces it. From this perspective, the continued existence of suffering does not imply that it should be preserved as a meaningful component of life. Instead, its persistence highlights the gap between what exists and what is necessary. Many conditions may persist within systems without being essential to their function, and suffering appears to fall within this category. Present, influential, but not structurally required for existence itself. This reinforces the position that suffering, while deeply embedded in lived reality, does not possess justification through necessity. Its presence is descriptive, not prescriptive. It describes how systems currently operate, not how they must operate. Therefore, its continued existence is not evidence of philosophical requirement, but evidence of structural conditions that allow its emergence. Ultimately, suffering and adaptation form a coupled system in which one defines the pressure and the other defines the response. However, neither determines the necessity of the other in a moral or existential sense. Adaptation does not validate suffering, and suffering does not validate adaptation. Both exist as mechanisms within a broader structure of continuous change, operating without inherent direction